Hey there, world history students. Today, we're going to be doing a kind of two-part lesson. The first part is just going to be to watch this screencast on the Palestinian Arab perspective. And the second part will be to answer 5 questions that are linked in a plan on its learning along with this screencast. So the purpose of today is to just give you an overview of the Palestinian Arab perspective to the ongoing conflict. Palestinians will often see themselves as a people without a land. You guys know this going back to our first lecture on the topic, which is the creation of the State of Israel was very fraught and divisive, and there was no certainty about whether or not everybody was on board with 2 states. The Arab population rejected the UN plan. The Israelis fought a war for the creation of the State of Israel. So there's a lot of resentment right from the beginning. Palestinians, from their perspective, are people who never left the land where the State of Israel was imposed over them. So this is kind of the grievance that they would articulate, as you probably saw in the David and Daoud reading on the topic, where there was the back and forth. For over 1,300 years, their roots go back to the time of the early Jews. If you go back to the Roman occupation of Palestine, the Palestinians would claim ancestry even back to that time as well. Both lived on the land together, certainly throughout much of the years after the Roman period and into the Middle Ages and the Crusades. There would have been a combination of both Jewish and Muslim, as Islam began as a religion, and Christians living side by side in this region. It's mostly Muslim, certainly after the Islamic era in the 600s and 700s, but there's always been also a Christian minority present. Overall, the Palestinian population, the Palestinian Arab population, numbers around 8 million people. Over half are going to currently live in refugee camps or in some sort of occupied territories that's under the auspices of the Israeli government and military. And this is a key thing that informs a lot of their beliefs. Why no land for the Palestinians? This is, you could argue, one of kind of the unfortunate legacies of the creation of the State of Israel in the wake of the Holocaust. The creation of Palestine or the creation of Israel was over the land that was historically known as Palestine, an area which includes modern-day Israel as well as the eastern part of Jordan, which is going to have a lot of ethnic Arab Palestinian peoples. There was never an independent Palestine, as you probably recognize from the David and Daoud reading. This is brought up consistently by David, the Israeli, is that there never was an independent Palestine, and that's often brought out as an argument by the Israelis. The United Nations, as you know, took over the area of Palestine after World War II, and in 1947 it decided to partition the land into a Jewish state and an Arab Palestinian state. Remember, that was the original partition plan. It never happened. The war ensued, and the Israelis created the State of Israel. Just a reminder, this is what that state would have looked like. This is what the UN partition plan of 1947 would have looked like. 55% of the land was allocated to the Israelis. 45% of the land in this original partition plan, again, was allocated to Arab Palestinians. Jerusalem would have been declared an international city. But here is a key element of the Palestinian perspective. When they looked at this original plan, one of the reasons they rejected it is they observed that the Palestinian Arabs were 67% of the population, but that UN plan only authorized them to get 45% of the land. So they saw this as a sort of insult and an unfairness. And this is a key element to that Palestinian perspective that Daoud would have mentioned. Palestinian arguments against partition, like why did they reject this? This is what we're going to try to explain here. They felt that an outside group like the United Nations shouldn't decide how land is divided. The United Nations, remember, was a newly created body. It didn't have the prestige and legacy. It was this thing that was created after World War II. So a lot of people at the time, especially if you're of a Palestinian Arab perspective, they didn't believe that the United Nations had the authority to really create a new nation state over territory that they occupied. The Arabs looked at the Jews in many cases as foreigners who were invading their land. Again, this is the Palestinian Arab perspective, that Jews that formerly lived in Europe after the Holocaust and maybe in the decades even prior to the Holocaust had shown up in Palestine and started living as foreigners in a new land. The United Nations, they would point out, and this is brought up by Daoud, as you recall, in 1947 was controlled largely by the big countries, the victors of World War II, who felt guilty about the Holocaust. And a lot of Arab Palestinians would say that this was not representative of the entire world's opinion. And they would also raise the question, why should Palestinians have their lands taken away when they didn't take part in the Holocaust? So why should their land be occupied by this new creation of the State of Israel? And they also would point out that no people should have to give up their land to a minority group. This is a key element of the Palestinian perspective. Jews made up 33% of the people living on the land in 1948, but the UN was willing to give them 55% of their land. This is something Palestinians would always point to when the question is posed to them, well, why did you reject the UN partition plan? Had you just accepted it, you could have had your own nation state. They would have pointed out all of these forms of unfairness. The effects of the birth of Israel from the Palestinian perspective. Nearly 1 million Palestinian refugees of the war after 1948 and their descendants now comprise somewhere around 6.5 million in the world today. And they're going to be occupying areas in neighboring Arab countries as well as areas of Israel that are occupied by the Israeli military. These people have few rights and terrible living conditions, and in many cases these camps will still exist today in one form or another. There's a lot of anger over the past, combined with few rights for Palestinians. This is one reason cited for terrorism that impacts Israel today. Palestinians see themselves as the weaker element, at least militarily and materially, so they feel that this is their only recourse against the overwhelming power of the Israeli military. And just to show you this progression, this was 1946 in the far left, and this is now today, and actually a more modern would even show this regressed even more. The regression of lands occupied as Palestinian territory, where they would have administrative control. This is an image, of course, of Palestinians looking out at the wall that Israel started to construct in the early 2000s, dividing Palestinian territories from Israeli settlements. And this barrier is something that ramped up quite a bit. This is 2002, so even this is somewhat dated, but these are Israeli checkpoints all throughout the West Bank, the area that was originally supposed to be the nucleus of a Palestinian state. And this is something that really colors the Palestinian perspective, that they are kind of having to go through these degrading checkpoints in their own land. And this is more imagery of that process. The wall that Israel started constructing in the early 2000s and has ramped up since then, Palestinians would raise the question, are the Israelis building this wall to make it safe to leave the land or safe for the settlers to stay? And again, this is something Palestinians would often point to, which is that Israeli settlements are a symbol of Israeli permanence and dominance over them. That's what they would argue. This is an image of an entire Palestinian city being walled in by Israeli settlements. As of 2014, you see the red and black and yellow constructed areas have wall and checkpoints. The green areas are currently under construction. And this is more footage of land being destroyed in this conflict, of bombings and destruction and the like. Firefights and so forth, and the real casualties of the violence of this conflict. And just to give you some historical perspective, this is a comparison between the Israeli wall that is built throughout the West Bank and the Berlin Wall, a wall that we know from European history and the Cold War. With that, your task right now is to take a 5-question quiz, and you're going to get 3 attempts, and we're going to take the highest score of your 3 attempts on those 5-question quiz, and it's going to be on the content from these notes. And good luck to you.